But as Maimonides says, not only is the purpose of the law to allow us to study the divine science, but it's also basically to increase and maintain our well-being in the material circumstances of our life. At the end of the guide, and this is the thing, the guide, at the instigation of the rabbis in Provence in the 13th century, the guide was burned. The rabbis persuaded the secular authorities to burn it. And what seems to have truly annoyed them was this idea that appears at the end of the guide in various chapters, where Maimonides takes every category of law from the Torah and shows its utilitarian value, how it contributes to a good life. And not just a good life insofar as I've achieved a distancing of myself from goods and evils in the world, but a kind of prosperity. There's no hint of austerity or withdrawal from the world. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wouldn't deny that the Stoic element is there, but I think it should not be overemphasized at the cost of the reading I'm giving. I think there's too much in Maimonides that's an emphasis on how to achieve success and flourishing as a physical human being in this world.
So it's Leibniz, really. Yeah. It's okay. You don't
There are a few steps in there. I'm making the leap, but I'll say yes, and you can explain to me afterwards what I just agreed to. But just to go back to your first one, I don't think it's philosophically incoherent. I mean, it seems like what you and I are disagreeing on is how to read the text, because the view I've given, I agree that there is that Stoic element, but it's basically the insurance policy for when the other strategy doesn't work, which doesn't seem to be philosophically incoherent.
But maybe uninteresting. But
It's uninteresting only okay, we'll talk later. Sorry.
So I wanted to pick up on some of these same points. I mean, I guess the one point is that if I want to be sure that I'm going to stay out of harm's way, I need both knowledge, and then it seems that I need at least some physical power. I mean, if I can see the big guy coming who's going to beat me up, if I can't run away faster, then it doesn't matter, know, how well I know it, it's still going to be a problem for me. So you need both. It seems you need both knowledge and power.
In response to Dan, I said that moral virtue is a necessary but not sufficient condition for intellectual virtue. The first necessary condition is physical well-being.
Oh, okay.
The virtuous person will be in good physical shape and therefore won't be distracted by the ailments of the body. So start running.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So just clarification on that. And then the other point is going back to in what sense this is really divine knowledge, because in some ways it sounds like all you really need is a kind of perfect knowledge of the laws of sort of very mundane nature, right? But in your paper you're suggesting that it involves knowledge of the Creator's own knowledge of his creation, and especially the most general aspects of it, involving the various levels of the intellect. One might say, well, what would you need all that for, as long as I know the actual laws that really, get me through the world in a safe way? Why all that extra stuff?
That's an interesting question, and one possible answer to that is that, and here we go back, I think, to Leibniz again, maybe Descartes, is that you want to know not just what the laws of nature are, but why they are as they are. And the divine science would give you insight into the metaphysical foundations for the laws, which would be of epistemic value. That is, your knowledge of why things happen as they do wouldn't regard them as mere probabilities, but as certainties. Even necessities. That's a stab at an answer to the question.
Well, it may involve a lot more knowledge of why the necessity comes in that particular way, and what are you really starting off with in terms of your knowledge?
Yeah.
And is there lots of textual evidence for this?
No, there's not.
Yeah, okay.
What we are definitely not starting out with is the will of an agent. Whatever lies behind the laws of nature here is not an arbitrary act or even a reasoned act of creation by a personal agent in the Guide of the Perplexed. In the legal writings, it's a much more personal God, someone who does seem to have not just causal powers and knowledge, but will, wisdom, justice.
Okay, Nancy and two further people, there's plenty of time, so
Nancy, you want to come up?
So you won't be surprised that as a philosopher of science, I'm interested in the bits that you didn't say that you were just talking to Eric about. What's the form of the knowledge that's in this overflow? It looks as if it's got general laws of nature, but general laws of nature aren't usually enough to, even if I knew them, right? And even if I could do all the calculations, you need knowledge of matters of fact.
Right.
Is it concrete knowledge? Is it really knowledge of laws of nature? Then what would the view about how nature works knowledge look like? I mean, does it look like laws of nature? And then just thinking about Dan's remark, if you do have free will, then presumably you're going to need something like God's foreknowledge to be part of the knowledge. If it's totally out of human nature, and somebody just does something absolutely arbitrary to you.
Right.
But I also wanted to couple that with, and these things are all really supposed to be possible for people outside the Garden of Eden. I mean, in principle possible.
In principle possible, as a matter of fact, highly unlikely unless you're a philosopher or a prophet. And the only difference for Maimonides between a philosopher and a prophet is that they have this, they're both hooked into the overflow, and therefore they have the same knowledge of nature. The difference is that the philosopher is incapable of communicating that to others. Whereas the prophet, in addition to perfecting the imagination, the intellect, the prophet has also perfected the imagination, and therefore can take this very abstract knowledge into morally motivating narrative stories. My guess as to what this knowledge looks like, and I would actually be interested in what a philosopher of science has, whether this would make sense, is a systematic knowledge of conditionals, that you know the laws of nature in the form of, if such and such happens, then that would happen. Here such and such is happening, therefore here's what's going to happen. If one locks one's bike to a rusty gate with a thin wire, it will get stolen. I'm tempted to lock my bike to this rusty gate, and so on, it will get stolen. So the knowledge of the laws allows you, in the face of certain concrete events, to see very clearly what the consequence of those events would be.
Well, it could all just be, it could just be knowledge of every bloody fact after another that's going to happen. Or it could be, I was just interested in whether, or more systematized knowledge that looks closer to something I could imagine anybody having access to, a sort of the kind of short system from which one's supposed to.
I think it's clearly the latter, and that's why I forget who brought up Bacon a minute ago,
Yeah.
but it's not abstracted from experience. It's an a priori knowledge of the laws themselves.
So it's knowledge of the laws, and then of all the initial conditions that you need to know in order to make knowledge of the laws useful. Yeah. Okay.
That's the only way it would seem to be able to work.
But is that in Maimonides, or is that you saying it's the only way you can figure out? That's what I was interested in. is
Yeah.
Does Maimonides have any?
No, this is my reading of Maimonides. Although what is interesting is that somebody once asked me, well, does Maimonides ever use the word laws? In fact, it seems anachronistic. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew text, he uses the word nomoi in Hebrew characters, which is, yeah, and my reading might still be anachronistic in that sense, but it probably means what he took Greek philosophers to mean.
But the idea of an overarching law of nature would seem to be anachronistic, for somebody in Maimonides' period.
Right. Unless that's what you think Maimonides means.
Yeah.
No, but it's entirely my interpretation. Maimonides it's so hard to make sense of these passages of the guide. This is my reading of it. It's a way of making sense of something. And here's some ex post facto evidence. Gersonides, who was a Maimonidean in many respects, is much more explicit about this. So I would say that Gersonides brings out, and I think Spinoza is in this same tradition as well, even more explicitly. But if it's permissible to read Maimonides through Gersonides, that is, through a very authoritative interpreter and follower less than 100 years later, that lends some credence to my reading, because I think Gersonides is much more explicit that what he's talking about here are laws of nature understood as general principles governing in a deterministic way the events that happen in the world.
So my question, I guess, relates to quote 4 on the handout. And I think it might tie into some of what you were saying at the end of the paper about the prosperity of the that you get by fortune not really being true prosperity. But so the end of quote 4 seems to suggest that the people who are outside of the overflow are doomed to have the really bad stuff happen, and not that it's just up to chance, because he describes them as being like one walking in darkness whose destruction is assured. But I thought that the position was supposed to be that if you're outside of the umbrella, it might rain on you, it might not. You're just, it's in the wind what's going to happen to you. Whereas the person who's under the umbrella doesn't have to worry about getting wet. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how assured the destruction is of the people outside of the umbrella.
Yeah, that's a good question. One answer, I'm not sure it's appropriate to this passage, but one answer is that their eventual destruction is assured. Because the virtuous person, the intellectually perfected person, will have a place in the world to come. The vicious person will not. Maimonides does not think evil people will be punished with fire and brimstone in Sheol or hell. He says they will simply be cut off. They will die. Whereas the virtuous person will not die. They will enjoy eternal felicity in the world to come. Does that work here? Not here. It seems like the destruction, it's not the ultimate destruction, but their life will be miserable. Yeah, I have to think about that. Because it can't be their destruction's assured, because it's up to chance.
Thanks for the paper. Mike, I have 2 quick questions. One is, it has to do with why I call this Providence, and the second one is why I think that possession of this knowledge, aside from having kind of intellectual virtue, would result, why you couldn't use this technological mastery for evil instead of good. I mean, so, exactly, yeah. So the first thing is just, I mean, if it sounds like God's providence here is just making knowledge possible, giving us capacity for knowledge. And so then, is all knowledge providential in this way? So even if there are innate things we know innately, or things we know necessarily, just as soon as we come on the scene, right, is that all providential too, or is
it sounds like that would fall under general providence, that something we have by virtue of belonging to the species.
Okay, so just even any knowledge is providential in this sense.
Yes, in one sense or the other.
Okay.
And in a way, this goes back to the question: what's God's role here? Dan's question.
Yeah.
I use phrases like God put in place this system. God has established, or the overflow comes from God. But if God is not a personal agent, God doesn't act with intentions and purposes for Maimonides. And yet, on the other hand, Maimonides spends a good deal of time showing us how God's law is intended to serve these purposes. So there seems to me to be an unavoidable ambivalence in Maimonides between treating God as a rational agent who acts for purposes versus treating God as this impersonal causal source of things. Could this knowledge be put to evil purposes? The answer is no, and for 2 reasons. First of all, moral virtue is a necessary condition for achieving intellectual virtue. So you won't even have this knowledge unless you've already achieved the moral virtues.
Even so that's what was mysterious, was couldn't you be really good at natural science and have tapped into that aspect of the overflow, but and then achieve a certain kind of intellectual virtue. But I mean, why is that